Every morning, just as the first rays of sunlight touched the rusted wings of an old fighter jet parked outside Fort Carson Air Base, a man appeared. He wasn't in uniform. He wasn't military staff. He wore worn jeans, a faded cap, and moved with the stiffness of age, but his hands. His hands knew every inch of that aircraft dot with quiet devotion. He wiped the dust from its frame, scrubbed the grime from its windows. Sometimes he just stood there, resting his palm gently on its side like he was listening to a ghost. People called him Old Joe. Most thought he was just a harmless veteran reliving memories. No one asked questions. Until one day, a visiting general stopped mid-step, stunned at the sight. He removed his cap, eyes wide, and whispered to a young officer beside him, "Do you know who that is?" What followed was a revelation that silenced the entire base. Because Joe wasn't just another forgotten face. He was one of the greatest real war heroes this country almost lost to time, a man whose battlefield courage, soldier sacrifice, and heroic acts had once saved hundreds. Yet no one remembered Dot until now. The military never forgets its planes, but sometimes it forgets its pilots. The aircraft sat like a fossil outside Fort Carson Air Base, an old F-100 Super Sabre, long decommissioned, paint-chipped, fuselage dulled by time. Most people barely noticed it anymore. It was just another display, a backdrop for newcomers, a monument to yesterday's glory, but not for Joe. He came every morning just after dawn, walking slowly from the edge of town with a limp that told its own quiet war story. No one knew where he lived, just that he always arrived like clockwork. He brought nothing but a rag, a metal thermos, and a small folded American flag tucked into his pocket. Always the same flag, always the same solemn look in his eyes. He never asked for permission. He didn't speak much, and for years, no one asked why. To the base personnel, he was a fixture like the weathered benches or the cracked pavement, a ghost of a forgotten era lingering around the silent jet. Some admired him quietly, others called him eccentric. A few even mocked him behind his back. Old Joe and his rust bucket, they'd chuckle, still fighting the Cold War. But beneath his faded jacket were the scars of battles that never made headlines, and a past the world had let slip through the cracks. He wasn't always a mystery 15 years earlier. Joe had tried to join the base's memorial committee. He wanted to volunteer, maybe even offer stories for the annual Veterans Day service. But the paperwork got lost. His records were incomplete. A new generation of officers had arrived, too busy, too modern, too disconnected. His service, it seemed, didn't register. He stopped trying after that. But the jet? The jet remembered. Every panel he cleaned, every smudge he polished, it brought something back. A face. A sound. A scream from 10,000 feet. The smell of fire, oil, and sweat. That F-100 wasn't just metal and bolts to Joe. It was a graveyard of memories. And in those quiet hours before the base stirred to life, it was his confessional. One morning, an airman named Blake, fresh out of training, noticed Joe at work. Curiosity got the better of him. "Sir, can I ask, why this plane?" Joe looked up with the kind of gaze that sees through you, not at you. He didn't answer at first, just wiped his hand across the aircraft's weathered serial number, 2137. "She brought me home." He finally said. Blake didn't know what to make of it. No one did. But the way Joe said it, like he owed the plane a debt no metal could repay, it stuck with Blake. The visit that changed everything. It was a quiet Thursday when the visiting general arrived. General Marcus Reed, a man known for his decorated service, sharp memory, and deep respect for military tribute. He was touring the base's flight wing and speaking with young recruits when he saw something out of place through the glass. A lone figure hunched over the old jet outside. "Is that plane still out there?" he asked, surprised. "Yes, sir," said one of the officers. "We've got a civilian who kind of takes care of it." Reed stepped closer to the window, and then he froze. Slowly he took off his cap. "That's not just a civilian." He rushed outside, followed by confused staff. As he approached Joe, the general's face shifted from confusion to recognition to disbelief. He called out, "Colonel Joseph Maddox?" Joe turned, cautious. "No one's called me that in a long time," he said quietly. Reed stepped forward and offered a salute. Not casual, not polite. A full, formal salute, crisp and unwavering. Joe hesitated, then slowly returned it. The silence around them was deafening. Reed looked to the others. This man flew over 200 missions in Vietnam, led the Operation Iron Rain Rescue, saved 2 downed squadrons in Laos. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross twice. He disappeared after his retirement. He turned back to Joe. "They told us you were dead." Joe chuckled softly. "I was. Just not all at once." A quiet life, a loud legacy, the story unraveled in the days that followed. Joe Maddox had retired early, disillusioned by a system that honored medals but forgot the men behind them. He lost his crew to a bad call from high command. Survivors blamed themselves. Washington buried it under paperwork. He left quietly, never asking for attention, never seeking praise. The war had taken more than his hearing in one ear and the function of his right knee. It had taken his identity. He had come to Fort Carson because it was home to the last F-100 he flew, tail number 2137, the same one that limped him out of enemy airspace on a half-dead engine with blood on the cockpit and ghosts in the sky. He never wanted the world to know. He just wanted to remember the power of recognition. General Reed made sure the story didn't end there. A ceremony was planned within 48 hours. Not a grand parade, just a respectful gathering. The base flag lowered, the honor guard dressed in full, and the jet, Joe's jet, clean to a shine not seen in decades. Joe stood beneath the wings, hands shaking as the general pinned a fresh medal to his chest. "This isn't for what you did back then," Reed said softly. "It's for reminding us now what real war heroes look like." That day, officers cried. Recruits clapped until their palms were raw. Even those who had once mocked old Joe stood in silent salute, learning for the first time what a living legend looked like. And when the sun set that evening, Joe stayed behind, hand resting on the jet's side. "Still got your back, old girl," he whispered. Some missions never make it into the textbooks, but they live forever in the hearts of those who survived. After the quiet ceremony at Fort Carson, something changed on base. Joe, the man once overlooked, became a presence that drew quiet respect. Young soldiers who once passed him by now nodded with reverence. Veterans who heard the news began arriving, sharing meals, stories, even just sitting in silence beside him. But there was still a piece missing. A story the general hinted at, and then refused to fully explain. "Ask him when he's ready," he told the base historian. "Some battles are too personal to be forced into daylight." It was Airman Blake who finally asked. They sat on a bench beneath the wing of the F-100. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden haze over the tarmac. Joe sipped from his old thermos and, after a long pause, nodded. "You want to know about Iron Rain, don't you?" Blake leaned in. "Sir, everyone's talking about it. They say you saved dozens of lives, but there's nothing about it in the official archives. It's like it never happened." Joe chuckled softly. "That's because, officially, it didn't. The call that changed everything, it was 1971. Vietnam was bleeding into Cambodia. Intelligence reports revealed a top-secret prison camp holding captured American pilots deep behind enemy lines. No one was supposed to know about it, but intercepted chatter hinted that the captives were going to be moved or executed within 72 hours. The Pentagon couldn't authorize a full assault without starting a diplomatic firestorm, but a rogue option existed, one that could slip in, rescue the pose, and vanish before anyone knew. It was called Operation Iron Rain. 4 pilots volunteered. 3 didn't return. Joe was the 4th. A suicide mission in the sky. He flew low, beneath radar, hugging the treetops of Los in the dead of night. The target was a makeshift jungle compound, nearly invisible from the air. Joe's mission was simple in orders, but impossible in execution. Drop a small, elite rescue team with pinpoint accuracy, then distract enemy forces long enough for them to extract a pose. I remember the silence in my headset, Joe recalled. Even the birds had gone quiet, like the jungle knew what was coming. He dropped the team under heavy fog, then climbed, circled, and began his dance with death. Anti-air fire lit up the night like a storm of sparks. His left wing took a hit. Fuel began leaking. But he didn't retreat. Instead, he flew back around, low and loud, drawing fire, pulling enemy forces toward him and away from the ground team. "You don't think about medals in that moment," he said. "You think about faces, the guys you trained with." "The one's still down there," the radio crackled. "Package secured." Moving to exfil. Joe was losing altitude fast. He radioed base command. "I'll cover them until they're clear." He looped once more, engine dying, hydraulics failing. He released the last of his flares to confuse heat-seeking rounds. It worked, barely. The rescue team made it out. Every last one of them. A plane and the promised Joe's jet limped back across the border, leaking fuel, smoke trailing behind him. He landed on a strip in Thailand, unconscious before the wheels stopped turning. Doctors said it was a miracle the plane held together. When he woke up, bruised and broken, the only thing he asked was, did they all make it? They had. The next day, the survivors were airlifted out, including 2 pilots who hadn't seen sunlight in over a year. One of them, Captain Raymond Stokes, later told his family, "An angel flew through hell to find us." But the operation remained classified. No parades, no public honors, no records. Joe was told to forget it ever happened. He didn't, and neither did the plane. F-100 #2137. The medal that never came for years. Joe received quiet thanks behind closed doors. Handshakes from commanders. Quiet nods at reunions. But he never spoke of it to civilians. He watched as history forgot the operation, the man, and the courage it took. It wasn't about recognition, he told Blake, but sometimes forgetting feels worse than dying. That's why, when he learned Fort Carson had acquired an old F-100 for display, he moved close by. One glance at the serial number -2137, and he knew. Somehow, the jet that had carried him through fire had found its way home. Like him, that's when he began showing up, quietly, daily, cleaning, watching, remembering. A silent reunion 2 months after Joe's story was revealed. Something unexpected happened. A group of men arrived at Fort Carson, slow-moving, silver-haired, eyes brimming with quiet fire. They wore jackets embroidered with a single word, Iron Rain. They were the survivors, the team Joe had saved. None of them had seen him since the day they were rescued. Most thought he hadn't survived. They lied. Up beneath the F-100, standing at attention. Joe stepped forward, trembling. And one by one, the men saluted him, not as a formality, but as a tribute. A military tribute long overdue. "I never got to say thank you," one of them whispered, voice cracking. You didn't just save our lives. You gave us back our families, our futures. You're the reason I got to hold my grandson last year." Joe wiped his eyes with the sleeve of his jacket. "I just did what any soldier would have done." The man shook his head. "No, Joe. You did what only the bravest could have done." Why we tell their stories that night, a plaque was placed beneath the jet. F-100 Super Sabre number 2137 in honor of Colonel Joseph Maddox and the unsung heroes of Operation Iron Rain, whose courage was classified but never forgotten. Blake, now the unofficial chronicler of Joe's story, posted the tale online. It spread like wildfire, a rare viral tribute that reminded a distracted world what real war heroes look like. Veteran groups across the country reached out. Forgotten heroes were rediscovered. Grandchildren learned about their grandfather's battlefield courage for the first time. And Joe? He kept coming to the jet. But now he was never alone. End of section 2. Courage doesn't retire. It simply finds someone younger to carry the weight. After the ceremony and the plaque, things changed at Fort Carson. Old Joe, once a silent shadow beside an aging aircraft, now found himself at the center of quiet reverence. Veterans came to shake his hand. Officers came to learn from him. But one person came every day, just as faithfully as Joe once had, Airman Blake. He was young, just 22. Eager, disciplined, but still new to the deeper truths of service. To him, the military had been a career path. A calling, yes, but one shaped by strategy, promotions, and duty. Joe would change that, not through lectures or formal orders, but by being present, a new kind of briefing. It started with simple things. Blake would bring an extra rag, help clean the plane. Then he'd bring coffee. Then questions. "Joe," he asked one morning, "why didn't you ever push to tell your story earlier?" Joe looked at him, eyes gentle but weathered. "Because the story didn't belong to me alone. It belonged to every man I flew with. Some came back, some didn't. The world moves on. But I stayed behind ... to remember." Blake thought about that in silence. Over the next few weeks, their conversations deepened, not just about war, but about what it meant to carry history inside your heart. Joe spoke of fear. Not the kind you feel when bullets fly, but the kind that creeps in after, when the world forgets, and silence replaces the roar of engines and gunfire. He spoke of soldier sacrifice, not as a moment in battle, but as a lifelong wound. The kind that doesn't bleed, but never heals, and Blake listened. He began keeping a journal, not for orders or training or drills, but for lessons. Joe's lessons. The memory box. One day, Joe brought a small box to the base. It was battered, edges worn. Inside were keepsakes, a dog tag scorched by shrapnel, a yellowed photo of a crew standing beside their aircraft, a folded letter written to a mother in Kentucky, never mailed, and a piece of a flight suit, torn and faded, stained with dried blood. "Every piece in here," Joe whispered, "is a life I remember, a story I carry." You want to be a soldier, Blake? Be the kind of man who carries more than a weapon. Carry them. Blake held the dog tag in his palm. It was heavier than it looked. He never forgot that moment. A quiet mentor, Joe. Didn't teach Blake to shoot straighter or march cleaner. He taught him how to speak to the Gold Star mother who visits her son's grave every year. How to look a fellow soldier in the eye and know when they're smiling on the outside, but drowning inside. How to walk past a memorial and whisper thank you, not out of ritual, but remembrance. He taught me to feel the uniform, Blake would later write, not just wear it. In one emotional storytelling session with fellow airmen, Blake recounted a night where Joe showed up to the base during a thunderstorm, drenched, limping, and still heading for the jet. "Why'd you come out in this?" Blake asked, concerned. Joe simply pointed to the clouds. Storms don't scare the dead. And they sure don't scare the ones who flew through worse to keep 'em alive. Passing the torch, months passed. Joe's steps grew slower. His hands trembled more often, but his voice, it remained steady. He began bringing Blake to veterans' meetings, introduced him to men with stories inked into their skin, buried beneath scars and silence. Blake would sit beside them, ask questions, take notes, and more than anything, listen. Then one day, Joe handed him something he had never shared with anyone else. A faded map. Drawn by hand. With red markings, handwritten notes, and a line. Across enemy territory. It was the original flight plan from Operation Iron Rain. Blake's breath caught. This ... belongs in a museum. Joe shook his head. No, it belongs with someone who still believes stories matter. Someone who'll carry the weight, just like we did. Blake didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His eyes said it all. An unexpected goodbye one cool October morning. Joe didn't show up at the jet. The base staff noticed first. Then Blake. He rushed to Joe's small apartment just outside the base. The landlord said he hadn't been seen since the previous afternoon. Inside, they found him in his chair, peaceful, calm, his cap in his lap, boots neatly placed beside the bed. On the table was his thermos and a single note addressed to Blake. When the war ends for a man, it doesn't mean the mission is over. You know what to do, son. Keep flying. And never let them forget. Blake held the note to his chest and wept. That week, the base held a full honors funeral. Flags at half-mast, taps echoing through the hangars. Veterans came from across the country. And standing at the front of it all was Airman Blake, now wearing Joe's dog tag beneath his own. A legacy lives on. Blake started a new program on base called Voices of Valor, a monthly session where soldiers, young and old, come together to share stories, memories, and moments of battlefield courage. No cameras, no ranks, just truth. He visited schools, telling kids about forgotten heroes, about old Joe and the jet that wouldn't be forgotten, about real war heroes who didn't seek fame, just purpose. And every morning, just like Joe once did, Blake walks to the F to 100. He brings 2 rags, one for the plain. And one for the tears. Some men die in silence, but their legacy echoes louder than any gunfire. Years passed. The old F-100 still stood, now gleaming beneath a protective awning, no longer forgotten, no longer weather-worn. Visitors often paused at the plaque. Beneath it, some reading, others simply standing in silence, unsure why their throat tightened when they looked up at that winged machine of war. They didn't know the full story, but they could feel it. Blake, now Staff Sergeant Blake Maddox, kept coming every morning. Yes, he took Joe's last name, not by legal decree, but by spiritual inheritance. A tribute to the man who had taught him that uniforms are temporary, but honor is eternal. The living memorial. Blake had turned Voices of Valor into a national project. With help from the Department of Veterans Affairs and military historians, he recorded hundreds of stories from aging veterans, stories that would have otherwise vanished with time. Each was edited into powerful segments and uploaded to a channel titled The Last Watch. Subscribers didn't just scroll through content, they felt it. Tears were common. So were messages from strangers. I never knew my grandfather was a hero. Until now, I served with Joe Maddox. I never got to thank him. Thank you for this. These stories healed something in me I didn't know was broken. Through these unsung heroes, the spirit of emotional storytelling reached across generations, restoring dignity to voices that had been buried under silence. The day the jet spoke one Memorial Day, an unusual visitor arrived at Fort Carson, a woman. in her late 60s, dressed plainly, with trembling hands. She approached the jet like someone approaching a grave. When Blake saw her, he recognized her from a faded photo Joe once showed him. Tucked into that old memory box. It was Helen, Joe's fiancée from decades ago. They had been separated by the war and silence. Letters stopped. Time passed. Life moved on. She had thought he was dead. "I only found out last week," she said through tears. "My nephew saw the video online. I didn't believe it until I saw the picture." Blake led her to the plane. "He never stopped loving you," he said. She ran her fingers across the serial number. "Neither did I." Then she reached into her bag and pulled out something tightly wrapped in cloth, a wedding ring she had worn around her neck for 50 years. "I waited all this time." Blake didn't speak. He simply placed the ring inside the cockpit near the original flight. Logbook, now preserved under glass. And the jet? It seemed to shine a little brighter that day. The final tribute. Blake made one final request before his last transfer, that the F-100 remain as it was, untouched, unmodified, except for one small addition. Just beneath the cockpit window, painted in military stencil font, were 5 words: LT Call Joseph Maddox, still flying. It was more than a tribute. It was a promise that this jet, and the story behind it, would never become just another static display. That battlefield courage, soldier sacrifice, and the quiet dignity of real war heroes like Joe would remain alive. Not in textbooks, but in hearts. A message to the living. On his last day at Fort Carson, Blake recorded one final message for the last watch. He stood beside the plane, wind rustling the flag above, his voice calm but steady. "This isn't just about war stories. It's about human stories. It's about men like Joe who gave everything, not for medals, but for each other. For freedom. For us. Too many of our forgotten heroes die with no one left to speak their name. So if you're watching this, remember, the most powerful way to honor the dead is to live a life worthy of this sacrifice. Carry their memory, share their story. And when you pass by an old veteran, stop, ask his name. Hear his silence, and salute it." He turned, rested his hand on the aircraft one last time, and whispered the words Joe once did, "Still got your back, old girl." Closing words. And so, the man who cleaned an old plane outside the air base every day, once dismissed as just another quiet old vet, became a symbol of everything this country should remember. Not just war, not just medals, but sacrifice, grace, and love for one another. Joe didn't want fame. He wanted to be useful, to serve, even after the world had moved on. And in doing so, he gave us all something far greater than stories. He gave us a reason to remember. Asterisk. If this story moved you, don't just like or share it. Pass it on. Because heroes like Joe only live if we refuse to forget them.